Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. It's crazy to think that nearly a year has passed since my last upload. Initially, I planned on just taking a break from making gaming videos because I had essentially burned myself out by uploading all those Dark Souls videos back to back, but upon noticing the amount of traffic those videos garnered, along with the fact that many commenters were asking where I had gone, I decided it was about time to make a return to YouTube. With that said, I still don't plan on using a specific upload schedule, but I'll definitely be posting more frequently when Elden Ring releases in February. Today we're going to be continuing my series of ranking the areas of the Souls games from worst to best. Dark Souls 3 undoubtedly has some of the series' best areas as well as some of the worst, and even some that are pretty mediocre. Without wasting any time, let's jump right into it. Although Dark Souls 3 as a whole has very few areas that I outright hate traversing, the Smoldering Lake and Old King's Antechamber are among the game's most obnoxious. Thankfully, most of the stuff here is optional, so I typically wind up skipping their content altogether and returning at the end of a run once I'm more leveled up. Quite frankly, I only bundled these two places together out of convenience because they actually have very different issues. The Antechamber is a drab, endless labyrinth filled with long, repetitive tunnels, and mainly a single enemy type in the form of those obnoxious grooves. Ultimately, I just find it to be very bland and lacking in creative design elements, from both an enemy placement standpoint and when it comes to the layout. The lake, on the other hand, is basically a giant canyon filled with tanky crabs, and it also has easily the most obnoxious environmental hazard in DS3 in the form of the rage-inducing ballista that seems to track your character perfectly. The giant worm is a cool enough enemy to deal with once you've taken care of the ballista, but that's not enough to bring this dumpster fire of recycled junk back from last place. I haven't ranked the areas of Dark Souls 1 yet, but when I do, you'll quickly learn how much I hate the Catacombs. So I'm pretty sure it'll be easy for you to guess how I feel about the Catacombs of CARTHUS. Okay, maybe it's not quite as awful as the Dark Souls 1 version with all the mages that revive the skeletons and dozens of precarious ledges to add even more difficulty to the mix, but I still hate fighting the skeletons, particularly the wheel variety that I know everyone is oh so fond of. Oh, and I also hate rats, which are also plentiful once you make your descent into this area. Another thing I hate about this area is how far you have to go in the opening stretch to get to the first bonfire. It's a painful slog and I dread having to sprint through it every time I make it here. I'm sure a lot of people would have expected me to place FARRON in last place, but don't worry. Just because there are two areas below it doesn't mean that this clusterfuck of a poison swamp is anywhere near good. I feel like complaining about the poison would simply make me sound like a broken record, so I'll be concise and just say that nearly every FromSoft poison level turns out to be more annoying and frustrating rather than being genuinely challenging and unique. FARRON only exacerbates this issue by forcing you to traverse areas that make your character slow roll while enemies remain at full speed. That is just plain aggravating. In addition, I'm not a fan of this area's aesthetics. I much prefer the dark, decrepit look of Blighttown or Harvest Valley over this iteration of the swamp. Oh, and I didn't even mention the basilisks yet, did I? Despite all these elements that infuriate me, I do have to give FARRON credit for having a captivating mechanic in the form of putting out the three flames to continue forward. I also do really like the upper area with the Wolf Covenant and the Demon mini-boss, and admittedly the area becomes much more enlivened once you get close to the Abyss Watchers and begin to run into Dark Wraiths. Still, what a shame that this area as a whole turned out to be yet another frustrating copycat of some of the series' most hated areas. It feels like they just didn't learn anything. When it comes to the Road of Sacrifices, there isn't one distinct thing that I hate about it, it's more so just the fact that it only serves as a gateway to the Cathedral and FARRON. Because of this, it doesn't really feel like its own area. Long story short, there's just not a lot to do here. It's a big, wide open swamp with very little content to take up all that space. Instead, the devs threw in crabs, poisonous bugs, and massive armies of these annoying lycanthrope hunters that have way too much range with their spears. The Black Knight in the back of the area is always a fun early game challenge, but everything else about the Road of Sacrifices is bland and overwhelmingly frustrating. The two NPC enemies that block the entrance to FARRON are near impossible to separate, making it feel like a seriously unfair fight. I don't know, maybe I'm hating on this place a little more than it deserves, but it's easily one of the more forgettable areas in the game for me. Speaking of forgettable areas, the Profane Capital is one that I often forget is even in the game until I get there. The required path that leads to the Yorm fight is very brief, with only a few gargoyles and jailer handmaidens to block your path to the Citadel. The optional segment, on the other hand, sucks. It's comprised almost entirely of, you guessed it, another poison swamp. Within the muck are plenty of sewer centipedes and other monstrosities to make your life a living hell. There is a decent enough NPC fight and several items to make exploring this nasty swamp worth your while, but as it stands, the Profaned Capital is yet another mediocre area in Dark Souls 3. I actually really enjoy the aesthetics and look of IRITHYLL Dungeon. It's super creepy and very reminiscent of the Prison of Hope in Demon's Souls. This decrepit dungeon is home to many of the game's creepiest enemies, such as wretches and mimics, but unfortunately it also has some of the more annoying ones as well. Jailers being able to drain your health simply by being within line of sight of you feels unfair and purposefully frustrating, especially when there are a dozen of them shoved into one room. While I appreciate the neat concept, the execution is just not there. Additionally, there are plenty of infested corpses to make you bleed and rats and basilisks to curse you if you don't watch your step. The labyrinthian layout of the dungeon is definitely its strongest feature, but the fact that there are jailers around every damn corner makes this area lose its charm real quick. Just judging by the footage playing in the background, I'm sure you can guess the main reason why I'm not a huge fan of the consumed King's Garden. Well, I guess there are two really. The first of which is, wow, what a surprise, another poison swamp. That being said, I find the Pus of Man enemies in this hellscape to be far more annoying than the swamp itself. Their erratic movesets and enormous hitboxes make them among the most frustrating to handle opponents in the entirety of Dark Souls 3, and they are goddamn everywhere in this place. Sure, there are some Titanite chunks and an Estus shard that are probably worth collecting here, but the King's Garden is entirely optional as long as you don't mind passing on some loot and one of the game's better optional areas that it leads to. For that reason, I almost always complete it, but it's never a particularly enjoyable experience. The DREG heap is an area that I'm actually quite split on. On one hand, it's a gorgeous introductory journey into the Ring City DLC with a large variety of different segments, environments, and enemy types. On the other hand, not only does it have a poison swamp, but it also has angels, which definitely rival the Ballista in Smouldering Lake for the title of most annoying environmental hazard in the game. These tanky bastards are damn near impossible to kill without taking out the pilgrims that revive them. The problem is that in order to locate the pilgrims, you often need to traverse a lot of precarious platforms, all the while being pelted by the aforementioned angels. Without this aggravating gimmick, I think the DREG heap could have been one of the better areas in the game. I do love the spectacle of taking those leaps of faith from the tops of cliffs in order to progress to the next section of the area, but too much of it is spent panic rolling in order to stay ahead of those damn angels. Thankfully, I think we're finally to the point on the list that each area from here on out is at the very least decent. While I don't love the Cemetery of Ash, I think a lot of players overlook its strengths. Layout-wise, it does a great job of familiarizing new players with the combat while still not completely holding their hands. If you dive deep enough, there are some nice early game challenges such as the giant crystal lizard and a surprise boss fight after reaching your first bonfire. This was the first From Software game that I ever played, and it makes me laugh when I think back to my early days when I thought Gundyr was hard. The cemetery is small and doesn't have much variation in enemy type, but it's definitely a solid introduction to the final game in the Dark Souls trilogy. While I personally think that Dark Souls 3's Firelink Shrine is the lesser of the series' hub areas, it still has a deeply haunting atmosphere that I'm always drawn to. The layout is similar to that of the Nexus from Demon's Souls, and the nostalgia doesn't end there. Blacksmith Andre from Dark Souls makes an appearance, and the somber, quiet atmosphere adds to the excellent aesthetic of this place. I also appreciate that there are many items hidden within and above the shrine, many of which I didn't even know existed until my third or fourth run in the game. The one major issue that I have with Firelink Shrine is that it lacks the mind-blowing connection to other areas that the first two Dark Souls games had. The only way to get to the High Wall of Lothric from Firelink is to warp. In my opinion, a vastly complex, non-linear pathway is just more immersive than warping from one zone to the next. Another visually splendid area with tons of interconnected pathways and shortcuts, the Cathedral of the Deep is massive in size and in challenge. While I can admit that the inclusion of thralls around every damn corner can get annoying, most of the enemies in the cathedral are well placed and enjoyable to fight. The giants are a pretty awesome addition, although you do have to fight one of them in a mucky swamp, but at least there's no goddamn poison in it. This place just has a lot of variety, from heavy-hitting knights to the terrifying Bloodborne-esque accursed spider. With tons of layers and excellent vertical design, I find it fairly easy to overlook some of the cathedral's flaws still. The ambushes in this place can be a bit excessive, and there are a few more ganks in this area than I would care for, but most of the ganks are just more of the same hollows you've been fighting up until this point, so they're still pretty manageable. Is this a controversial spot for the KILN? I'm not really sure, but I know there's not really much to do here other than sprint straight towards the Soul of Cinder and engage in an epic final battle, but that almost works to the area's advantage in my opinion. By this point in the game, most players will have slogged through all kinds of hells to make it to this point. I appreciate that rather than a long pathway of annoying enemies to block your path to victory, you're instead left with a beautiful, scenic view as you approach the endgame. Sometimes it's just nice to have some peace and quiet, and the KILN of the First Flame is one of the best and most gorgeous areas to obtain that from. Not gonna lie, I have a difficult time deciding how to feel about the Grand Archives. On one hand, it feels like an upgraded version of the Duke's Archives from Dark Souls with less confusion and enemies that are less annoying. I also find the cursed bookshelves to be a unique design choice that encourages players to dip their head in wax before exploring the entirety of the area. The layout is pretty well done in that there are plenty of shortcuts and secret passages that can easily be missed if you rush through. The enemies, including those creepy scholars, gargoyles, and knights, are all generally pretty enjoyable to fight. The inclusion of the crystal sage that you intermittently encounter on your way up the tower is a nice surprise. I also really like the NPC trio that you face towards the end of the archives. I know some find them to be annoying, but it's not all that hard to lure them inside, separate them, and punish. Add to that, the latter half of the archives is a gorgeous build-up to one of the game's best bosses. I used to dislike the archives for how dark and challenging they are to explore, but it's definitely grown on me. In fact, this is probably the area that's risen the farthest on the list. From what I've read, not many people are fond of the undead settlement as I am, so this might be an unpopular opinion. Love it or hate it, it's a pretty tough area to get through so early in the game. There are enemies around every corner, and much like the Cemetery of Ash, it feels like a tool designed to teach players that one little slip-up can lead to your death. This area also has a variety of different environments, from the hollowed village that you begin with to the tower in which you can befriend the giant archer that moments ago was trying to kill you. There's just so much to explore here, from many NPCs to the depths of the sewers and the many enemies within, which, despite being grouped together quite frequently, are some of the better ones in the game in my opinion. I can't quite put my finger on why, but I just love fighting the evangelists. As you make your way to the Road of Sacrifices, you'll also encounter one of the deadliest monstrosities the early game has to offer, the Outrider Knight. This area certainly isn't perfect, but I do have a lot of fond memories of playing through it. The untended graves are basically a copy and paste of the Cemetery of Ash, but this version is shrouded in darkness and death. Despite being just as short as its template, there's something about the pitch black nothingness in the untended graves that really creeps me out. The eerie silence is quickly broken when you realize that the enemies here are a considerable upgrade from the hollows found in the cemetery. There are grave wardens, which I absolutely love, 2 ravenous crystal lizards, and plenty of skeletal dogs. Normally I could complain and bitch about the dogs for hours, but I'm willing to make an exception in this case. Sure, they're annoying as ever, but they can give you a pretty good jump scare if you happen to miss one, which I think just really fits this area. There's also another solid NPC invader and an upgraded version of Gundyr to fight you once you pass the wardens. Sure, this area isn't very long or inventive, but the atmosphere of the grave trumps all of its flaws for me. Still, being as short as it is means that there are still a half a dozen areas or so that are even better than this one. During my first run, LOTHRIC Castle was probably the area that gave me the most trouble. In addition to housing some of the most hard-hitting enemies in the game, it's also a pretty massive area with lots of ambushes that will result in you being surrounded by enemies if you don't tread carefully. I like an area that encourages the player to think before they act, and this castle has a lot of punishing hazards to demolish you if you don't. The dragons certainly add to the spectacle of reaching such a significant area in the game's lore, and although they are ultimately killed by taking out the pus of man controlling them, doing so isn't too bad as long as you have some firebombs handy. It's also worth noting that the LOTHRIC and Winged Knights are among my favorite enemies in the entire game, and there are plenty of them strung throughout the castle. From a design perspective, it's difficult to fault this area for its few and far between issues. Overall, I really enjoy it. ANOR LONDO's appearance in Dark Souls 3 is understandably polarizing. Its inclusion is almost entirely motivated by fan service, being that it's basically a step-by-step rehash of the iconic location from Dark Souls 1. With that said, I don't mind fan service when it's done right. I think it's safe to say that ANOR Londo is the most beloved area in the series, so to see it pop up again in the climax of the Dark Souls journey isn't something I'm about to complain about. The change in aesthetics from clear skies to a snowy landscape helps this iteration to feel older and more run down. Additionally, it's always sad to see the corpse of the giant blacksmith from the first game. It really adds to the bittersweet ambience of this once lively city. The one thing that this version lacks is the interior depth that the original had. This time around you spend very little time moving from room to room inside the main building, which is definitely a bit disappointing. I'm also not a huge fan of the deacons you fight inside, which aren't a very worthy replacement for the Silver Knights that do make a return with a vengeance outside the building. Admittedly, this area wouldn't be much without the fact that it's basically copy and pasted from the first game, but the nostalgia that I feel while playing through it is pretty damn effective. The first DLC of Dark Souls 3 is one of the largest areas in the entire game. As such, each section of ARIANDEL varies slightly in quality, but as a whole it's pretty damn great. I inherently have a high affinity for snowy areas because they're so visually pleasing to look at, and it's tough to argue otherwise in the case of the Painted World. The first segment is best handled by sprinting straight through because there are a lot of wolves to make short work of any player that dares to take them on. From there, the area only improves in quality as you cross the bridge that leads to the cathedral. You'll soon meet Sister Frida and embark on a massive adventure through a Corvian settlement filled with dangers. As I said, the area definitely does have some ups and downs at certain points, but its massive size and plethora of content to explore definitely lands it in the front of the pack. Serving as Dark Souls 3's first real area after Firelink, the High Wall of Lothric has everything a good introductory Souls area should have. I don't want to be too repetitive, but the High Wall once again works wonders to get new players acquainted with the winding design of Soulsborne areas as well as the combat and enemies they'll need to face. Most of these enemies are basic hollows, but that's kind of the charm of the High Wall, similar to that of the Undead Burg in Dark Souls. It's also extremely eerie to see all the non-aggressive hollows kneel down in prayer as you walk by. Eventually, players will be introduced to LOTHRIC and Winged Knights, which serve excellently as a proper challenge for more experienced players. With all of this, in addition to great level design and shortcuts, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the best zones in the entire game. Before I talk about everything that I love about Archdragon Peak, I do have to bitch for just a second about the goddamn rock lizards. Look, I didn't even have the drive to go record footage of them because they're so motherfucking annoying, but let's just say that being pancaked while trying to outrun a giant wyvern is particularly annoying. Okay, with that out of the way, I can say with confidence that the rest of this mesmerizing landscape is the pinnacle of Souls areas. These cliffsides look amazing and provide a real good looking backdrop as you fight the many man-serpents that are found within the peak. Some find these enemies to be really annoying, but I don't get the hate. They're not all that bad really as long as you lure them aside one by one, and the larger versions with battle axes are a ton of fun to fight, at least in my opinion. As you make your way further up the peak, you'll encounter other great enemies such as the Drakeblood Knights and summoners that bring in an infinite number of clones until killed. This is great for soul farming and once again provides a nice challenge for new players. Hell, even Havel makes a quick appearance, although I didn't get footage for it for this video. Thankfully, I'm not taking bosses into consideration really when I make this list because the Ancient Wyvern is one of my least favorite in Dark Souls 3. The Ringed City is another massive DLC area, but unlike Ariandel, this one is perfectly paced. I don't think there's a single part of exploring this incredible area that I can recall as being tedious or frustrating. There's no doubt that it's one of the most challenging in the series, with enemies of the likes of Ringed Knights, Judicators, and Herald Knights. There are also plenty of disgusting insect-like creatures and a mini-boss in the form of Dragon Slayer armor from LOTHRIC Castle. I don't know, I think the challenge in this area, despite being very high in level, is totally fair and very rewarding to overcome. This area is also brilliant in the way that it slowly builds to the fights with Gale and Midir. Encountering the massive wyvern himself at multiple points during the journey before the final battle is a perfect way to build tension. Of course, this area wouldn't be half of what it is without the boss fights living up to the hype, but thankfully they more than deliver. Although I have to admit that Dark Souls 3 as a whole doesn't have many areas that I consider to be the best of FromSoft as a whole, these top two are most definitely falling into that category. Despite how much I love the Ringed City, no area can even match the surreal beauty of the IRITHYLL of the Boreal Valley. The feeling I get every time I emerge from the god-awful catacombs to approach this giant detailed city can best be described as overwhelming joy. Not only does this place look phenomenal, but it also contains some of the best content in all of the Souls series. When you first set foot on the bridge, taking in the incredible view, the last thing you're probably expecting is an enormous Sullivan's beast to eat you whole. But I imagine that's exactly what happened to most new players. If you're able to make it to the first bonfire, you'll be introduced to some of my favorite enemies in the series, Pontiff Knights. These majestic warriors look so elegant when they attack you that I oftentimes prefer to watch them dance rather than kill them. The Irithyllian slaves are also rightfully creepy, and the invisibility gimmick is pretty clever, being that you can only see their eyes until they get close to you. Of course, I do have a few nitpicks, such as the gank squad of dogs just before the shortcut to Pontiff, but even that is very manageable as long as you don't rush in recklessly. Once you defeat the Pontiff, you'll reach the incredible road to ANOR Londo, which features an equally beautiful landscape with a whole new variety of great enemies, such as giants, silver knights, and a few hostile NPCs. Additionally, the section just after the boss fight is one of the most common PvP hotspots, and I have so many fun memories of playing there. If you're in the Aldrich Faithful Covenant, you're pretty much going to get summoned there every 5 seconds, and it's an absolute blast. I'm not really sure if people are going to agree with me on this one, but I think this is a truly iconic area and easily the best in Dark Souls 3. And there you have it, guys, all 22 areas in Dark Souls 3 ranked from worst to best in my opinion. As always, feel free to drop your list in the comments, or at least some of your favorites and least favorites. I'm always curious to know what you guys think and if you agree or disagree with my opinions. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to tune in for the next video. See you later.